February 1959. 9 experienced hikers entered the frozen mountains of the Urals, in the Soviet Union. They never came back. Weeks later, rescue teams found something impossible to explain. The tent had been cut, from the inside. And the footprints in the snow showed that the group fled in the middle of the night, directly into the deadly cold. To this day, nobody knows exactly what happened at Dyatlov Pass. The group was made up of young experts in extreme hiking. They had survived storms, brutal temperatures, and dangerous routes before. But that mountain would be different. On the night of February 1st, they set up their tent in an isolated area completely covered in snow. The temperature was dropping below -30 degrees. And something happened. Something so terrifying, that they abandoned the tent immediately. No coats. No boots. Some of them left barefoot. When the rescuers arrived weeks later, they found human footprints slowly moving away from the camp. They didn't look like footprints of people running. It looked like they were walking, confused. As if something had forced them outside. The first bodies appeared near a frozen forest. They had tried to start a fire before dying. But the worst had not yet been found. Months later, the other bodies appeared beneath the snow. Some had brutal fractures in their chest and skull. But strangely, there were almost no external wounds. One of the victims had no tongue. Another had their eyes completely destroyed. And some of the clothing showed traces of radiation. The Soviet Union quickly closed the investigation. The official cause was, an unknown force impossible to overcome. More than 60 years later, the mystery is still alive. Was it an avalanche? A military experiment? Something that was never meant to be seen? Nobody knows. But one thing is certain. That night, in the frozen mountains of Dyatlov Pass, something made 9 people run toward the darkness. But the story doesn't end there. Because when investigators began analyzing every detail, they found things that didn't add up. Things that had no logical explanation. Think about this for a moment. There were 9 people. 9 people who had climbed mountains in winter before. Who understood the risks of extreme cold. Who knew perfectly well that going outside without clothing in -30 degrees meant dying within minutes. And yet, they went out. They cut the tent from the inside. And walked toward the darkness. What could make someone make that decision? What could be so terrifying, that you'd rather face deadly cold than stay inside? That is the question that has gone unanswered for decades. Investigators analyzed the photographs. The last photos taken by the group before they died. Some showed laughter, jokes, normal moments from an expedition. Nothing that suggested fear. Nothing that suggested danger. It looked like just another night. Until it wasn't. The last known photograph was taken that evening. It showed the tent already set up. The campsite ready for sleep. And after that, nothing. Only silence. Only snow. Only 9 people who never spoke again. When the first rescuers arrived at the site, they were in shock. Not because of what they found, but because of what they didn't find. There were no signs of a struggle. No traces of animals. No evidence of an avalanche at that exact point. Just a tent cut from the inside. And footprints slowly walking away toward the forest. Experts studied those footprints for weeks. And they reached a disturbing conclusion. The footprints showed no panic. They showed no desperate running. They showed a walk, almost calm. As if the group had left by their own will. As if they had chosen to walk toward the cold. Why would you calmly walk toward your own death? What state of mind leads someone to do that? Some theories talk about extreme panic that shuts down rational thinking. Others talk about something that directly affected their ability to reason. But none of them explain everything. None of them fully closed the case. The first two bodies were found near a large fir tree. They were barefoot, wearing minimal clothing. And their hands were burned. Burned from trying to make fire. From trying to survive until the very end. That says something about human beings. Even in the most desperate moments. We keep fighting. We keep trying. Those two young people, alone in the darkness at -30 degrees. Tried to start a fire with their bare hands. They didn't make it. But they tried. The other bodies took longer to appear. Some were found months later, when the snow began to melt. And those were the most disturbing. 4 of them were in a kind of improvised shelter beneath the snow. They had dug a hole. They had tried to protect themselves. But the injuries they had didn't match any simple fall. One woman had rib fractures equivalent to those from a car accident. One man had a fractured skull, from the inside. As if enormous pressure had crushed his head. No visible external wounds. No cuts. No marks. Just brutal internal fractures. The forensic doctors of the time said something nobody forgot. The force required to cause these injuries is comparable to that of a moving vehicle. But there is no evidence of external impact. How does something fracture your bones from the inside, without leaving a single scratch on your skin? That question still has no answer. And then there was the tongue. One of the victims had no tongue. Investigators initially suspected animals. But the edges of the wound were too clean. Too precise. And the eyes. Another victim had their eyeballs completely destroyed. Not from blows. Not from exposure to the cold. Destroyed in a way that experts could not explain. And the clothing. When they analyzed the group's clothing, they found traces. Traces of radiation. Not in all the clothing. Only in certain specific garments. Where did that radiation come from? What was the Soviet military doing in those mountains? Had they been used as unwanted witnesses to something they were never supposed to see? The Soviet Union closed the case within weeks. They classified the files. They banned expeditions to that area for years. And they gave an official response that answered nothing. Unknown force impossible to overcome. That is not a conclusion. That is a closed door. Over the years, dozens of theories emerged. Some scientific. Some military. Some that I'd rather not say out loud. The avalanche theory was dismissed multiple times. The terrain didn't match. The footprints didn't match. And if there had been an avalanche, the bodies would not have been where they were. The military theory gained ground when it was discovered that the area was used for secret missile tests. Witnesses in nearby villages reported strange lights in the sky that night. Glowing spheres moving in silence. Were they victims of a military test gone wrong? Were they killed to silence them? Or were they simply in the wrong place at the wrong time? Some people believe in something different. Something that science cannot easily explain. Infrasonic sound. Frequencies so low that the human ear cannot hear them. But the body feels them. Infrasound can cause extreme panic. It can cause hallucinations. It can make you feel a presence that isn't there. Make you feel something is coming for you. That you need to run at any cost. What if that night, in that mountain pass, something generated a frequency that drove 9 healthy people out of their minds? That made them run into the cold without being able to think. That killed them from the inside, without leaving visible marks. We don't know. Nobody knows. In 2019, the Russian government officially reopened the case. 60 years later. They said they would investigate again. That they would look for answers. Their final conclusion was, snow avalanche. Nobody in the world of independent investigation believed it. Because an avalanche doesn't explain the missing tongue. It doesn't explain bones broken without external wounds. It doesn't explain the radiation. It doesn't explain why they cut the tent from the inside. Dyatlov Pass is named after the leader of the group, Igor Dyatlov. He was 23 years old. A brilliant engineering student. He had organized dozens of expeditions before. Today, his name is synonymous with mystery. With something that happened one night in the mountains. That nobody has ever been able to fully explain. There is a photo of Igor that circulates online. A photo taken days before the expedition. He is smiling. He is full of life. He has no idea what is waiting for him. That photo haunts me. Because it reminds me that behind every mystery, there are real people. Real young people. With real families waiting for them at home. And those families waited. And waited. And when the news came, the news had no explanation. Imagine receiving that phone call. Your son died in the mountains. What happened? We don't know. An unknown force. And spending the rest of your life not knowing what happened to your child. Not knowing if they suffered. Not knowing what they saw. Not knowing what they felt in their final moments. That is the most terrifying thing about Dyatlov Pass. Not the mystery itself. But the questions that were left unanswered. For the families. Forever. More than 6 decades have passed. And we are still here. Talking about that night. Trying to understand. Trying to find an answer that makes sense. Because something in us needs to know. Something in us cannot accept that there are things without explanation. That there are nights when things happen that reason cannot process. But Dyatlov Pass teaches us something important. It teaches us that reality is sometimes stranger than any fiction. That there are places in this world where things happened. That we still don't understand. And perhaps we never will. That night in February 1959. 9 people entered the mountains. 9 experienced people. 9 people who knew what they were doing. And something happened. Something that made them cut their own tent. Something that made them walk out into -30 degrees without clothing. Something that killed them in ways that science still cannot fully explain. What was that something? I don't know. Nobody knows. But if you're ever in the mountains, on a cold night, and you feel something you can't explain, something that makes you want to run outside, remember Dyatlov Pass. And ask yourself, what did they see that night? Thank you for listening all the way to the end. If this mystery left you thinking, share this video with someone who also wants to know the truth. Because there are questions that deserve to be heard. Even if they never have an answer.